Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into stone corridors where shadows stretch long and bells echo like whispers through time. Picture yourself in a medieval monastery. Walls so thick that the night air feels muffled, corridors faintly damp, the scent of old wood mingling with candle wax. You're here not for sightseeing, but to inhabit the rhythm of monks whose nights unfolded in a cadence utterly foreign to our modern 9-to-5 lives. Their hours were measured not by buzzing phones or glowing alarm clocks, but by the clang of bells and the watchful eye of abbots. And just so you know, you probably wouldn't survive this schedule. Unless you've trained your body to wake up at midnight, shuffle across icy flagstones barefoot, chant psalms half asleep, and then still manage to copy neat Latin manuscripts before dawn. You'd be curled up in a corner begging for an espresso that wouldn't exist for another 300 years. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight and what's the local time? Drop it down below. It's always fascinating to see the little map our sleepy community makes across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle into the evening service known as Vespers, the first formal step of the nightly rhythm. The church glows faintly from beeswax candles that sputter and hiss, dripping wax like slow clocks marking the seconds. The monks chant in low tones, Latin syllables flowing in unison, a sonic blanket that stretches across the stone hall. You notice something odd. It doesn't feel like the end of the day here. For them, this is just the first notch on a wheel that will keep spinning through the dark hours. After Vespers, you're led down a long hall where silence reigns. The Great Silence, as it was called, wasn't just a casual shill. It was a binding rule. No chatter, no jokes, not even a whispered complaint about Brother Thomas snoring too loudly. Historians still argue whether the silence was broken more often than records admit, because monks, being human, probably bent the rules when they thought the abbot wasn't listening. But officially, the silence after Vespers meant your words had to stay locked inside your head until morning. You trail the group into a refectory where a light evening meal is served. It's not exactly the kind of midnight snack you're dreaming of. Think vegetable broth, bread so dense it could double as building material, and maybe some cheese if the monastery had good cows that season. You chew along politely, try not to imagine a cheeseburger. Humor aside, the meal had purpose. Monks weren't supposed to be weighed down by heavy dinners that could tempt them toward laziness or long sleep. Sleep was spiritual work, not indulgence. The hours following dinner settled into a routine shaped by the canonical schedule. Monks might slip back into the church for Compline, the last prayer before sleep, often involving a hymn asking God for protection through the night. This ritual created a bookend, a sort of mental switch to shift them from chanting to sleeping. And then, finally, they shuffle to the dormitory, a communal hall lined with rough wooden cots. You lie down on one, the straw mattress crunching under your weight, your blanket scratchy wool. It's not cozy by modern standards, but in the candle glow, surrounded by the hush of cloister life, there's something strangely peaceful. Your eyelids droop, but you can't forget that the peace won't last long. At some unholy hour, midnight or thereabouts, the bells will ring again, slicing into your dreams like a sword. That's because monks followed a rhythm called the Liturgy of the Hours, dividing day and night into prayer segments. And unlike your snooze button, the monastery's bells didn't negotiate. When they clanged, you rose. Period. Imagine it. You've barely settled into sleep, and suddenly the entire dormitory stirs like a disturbed anthill. Robes are pulled back on. Sandals shuffle across the cold floor, and the long procession begins toward the church for Matins, the midnight prayer. You rub your eyes and trudge along, thinking dark thoughts about whoever invented the schedule. But for the monks, this interruption was essential. They believed night was the holiest time to pray, when distractions were minimal and the world itself seemed hushed. One mainstream historical fact slips into focus here. Many monasteries genuinely designed their architecture to guide this nightly rhythm. Corridors between dormitories and chapels were made straight and narrow, so monks could walk in sleepy unison without bumping into each other. Some even had grooves worn into the stone from centuries of half-awake feet trudging to matins. You picture generations of weary monks carving a footpath simply by their nightly obedience. And then there's the quirkier side. Records show that some abbots worried too much sleeping made monks soft. So they designed the schedule almost as a form of spiritual resistance training. A few even suggested that monks should lie on wooden boards instead of straw mattresses, just to avoid indulgence. You stretch your back on the straw and think, maybe I should never complain about my spring mattress again. Yet scholars still debate whether every monk followed this midnight ritual to the letter. Some argue that the strict schedule was more idealized rule than daily reality, pointing to scattered notes about monks oversleeping, sneaking in naps, or even being excused from matins if they were ill or old. Was the midnight prayer really universal, or was it more flexible depending on the monastery? Historians still argue whether the perfect schedule was ever as airtight as the manuals claimed. By the time matins ends, you've been up chanting for a good stretch, your stomach grumbling again because bread and broth don't last long. You shuffle back to bed, but not for a full night's rest. This is more like an intermission in a strange play where the curtains keep opening and closing. You collapse onto your straw mattress, already aware you'll be up again before dawn. In this rhythm, sleep feels less like an extended retreat and more like scattered pockets, carefully engineered to keep your spirit sharp and your body slightly weary. It's a paradox. Exhaustion itself was seen as a path to holiness, and as you drift in and out of broken dreams, half remembering chants, half imagining a modern coffee cup, you realize that the nightly rhythm of monks wasn't simply about sleep. It was about reshaping the human body into a vessel of constant prayer, one bell at a time. You're still groggy when the bell's last echoes fade, and your body begs you to stay horizontal. But this monastery is no luxury spa, and the rules don't care about your REM cycle. You trudge along with the others, chanting done, the night not yet over, until the abbot finally waves the group back toward the dormitory. You shuffle through a narrow doorway, and suddenly you're inside the vast communal sleeping hall, the dormitory, the heartbeat of monastic nightlife, if you can call it that. The dormitory stretches out like a medieval barracks, row upon row of straw-filled mattresses, or sometimes just planks with thin covering. Each monk's space is marked, not by walls or curtains at first, but by sheer repetition. Bed, robe, sandals, bed, robe, sandals. The sameness itself becomes a kind of architecture. Imagine dozens of men breathing in rhythm, their snores overlapping into what might almost sound like Gregorian chant if you squint your ears. There's no My Corner in your corner, no posters of medieval pop stars, unless you count a faded saint's icon. Just uniformity, discipline, and a faint whiff of hay and humanity. But not all dormitories were identical. Some monasteries allowed for curtains, little cloth partitions that gave a monk the tiniest semblance of privacy. Curtains may not sound like much, but in a world where silence ruled and individuality was constantly flattened, even a scrap of fabric to mark "This is mine" could feel like a luxury condo. Historians still argue whether these curtains were approved or frowned upon, since too much seclusion risked temptation. After all, privacy breeds secrets, and secrets could lead away from God. The rules governing dorm life weren't just about where you lay your head. They spilled into the details of how you lay it. For instance, monks were often required to sleep in their habits. Their robes, tied with cord, no soft pajamas, no shedding layers. Why? Practicality and vigilance. If a fire broke out, or if Matins' bell rang suddenly, they could leap up and head straight to chapel without fuss. It also added to the spirit of discipline. You weren't meant to be comfortable. You were meant to be ready. Imagine sleeping every night in what amounts to a woolen bathrobe that scratches in summer and freezes in winter. You shift on your straw mattress, realizing how much you take sweatpants for granted. And then the rules of posture. Some monastic codes hinted that monks should lie on their backs, hands crossed, a posture mimicking death, or at least readiness for resurrection. Was every monk actually that obedient in the middle of the night? Probably not. One quirky tidbit from scattered accounts suggests that some monks quietly propped themselves with staffs, nodding off while seated, the way a tired student might fall asleep at their desk. It wasn't noble, but it kept them technically awake, ready to answer prayer bells without untangling from blankets. And of course, the no-talking rule didn't end at the dormitory door. Even if Brother Matthew was sawing logs like a medieval chainsaw, you weren't supposed to complain. Silence was golden, even when you wanted to throw your pillow, if you had one, at his head. This made the dormitory both a sanctuary and a test of patience. Your mind would drift in that fragile quiet, only occasionally interrupted by the inevitable coughs, sneezes, and the universal sound of humans failing to sleep in perfect harmony. There's a historical fact here worth noting. Some monasteries actually placed their dormitories above the church, so that when bells rang, the monks could file straight down a staircase to prayers. It was architectural efficiency at its finest. Think of it like medieval bunk beds stacked on top of the chapel. And yet, there's a quirky contradiction. In some orders, especially the stricter ones, monks had to leave their shoes at the dormitory door. This meant they shuffled barefoot along icy floors at 2 a.m., a detail that adds both comedy and misery to the scene. You pause, wondering, did any monk sneak in extra comfort? Historians still argue whether monks adhered to the strict bedding rules or secretly padded their straw mattresses with contraband feathers, smuggle wool, or even extra blankets. The official records are silent on these little cheats, but the human imagination fills in the gaps. Surely someone, somewhere, bent the rules for the sake of a warm night. And here's another angle. The dormitory wasn't just about sleeping, it was about surveillance. The communal setting meant no monk was truly alone. Privacy was an enemy, because with privacy came temptation, whether of food, forbidden books, or wandering thoughts. The dormitory acted as a kind of nightly accountability system, a soft prison where the bars were woven from shared discipline. If you stirred, the whole room stirred. If you rose, the whole room noticed. In modern terms, it's like sleeping in a giant group chat you can't mute. As you lie there, trying to imagine yourself in this nightly grind, a few stray jokes bubble up in your tired mind. 1. Monks may not have had Netflix, but they had the original binge schedule, except instead of seasons of the show, they binged on psalms. 2. The monastery dormitory was probably the birthplace of team-building exercises, except here the exercise was surviving communal snoring. 3. If you thought your college roommate was bad, imagine 30 roommates with identical haircuts and one alarm clock shaped like a bell tower. Eventually, exhaustion drags you under, though lightly, because you know the next bell isn't far off. The dormitory isn't a place for deep, unbroken dreams. It's a holding pen between summons, a halfway station on the journey from one prayer to the next. You settle into that odd rhythm, a sleep that is never entirely your own, always subject to the call of ritual. By now, you begin to understand. The dormitory is not just a room. It's a symbol. It embodies a monastic attempt to erase individuality and replace it with rhythm, uniformity, and shared discipline. You can't sprawl, you can't customize, you can't even fully dream without the threat of interruption. But in that suppression of comfort lies the core of their devotion. Sleep is never an escape here. It's just another tool for shaping the soul. And as you drift off in this hall of synchronized breathing, you sense how strange, how alien, and yet how curiously human it is. Even in the strictest silence, surrounded by uniform robes and straw mattresses, the dormitory is alive with the ordinary chaos of bodies trying to rest. Somewhere in the shuffle of limbs, the creak of boards, and the muffled sighs, you feel the weight of centuries pressing down, whispering that this was not just a night's lodging. It was a spiritual training ground disguised as sleep. The silence of the dormitory lingers as you drift in and out of shallow dreams. But soon enough, the monastery reminds you that your body is not in charge here. A bell clangs, not a gentle wind chime, not the polite ding of a hotel lobby. This is a resonant, metallic bellow that rattles through stone walls and straight into your bones. You flinch awake, eyes wide in the dark, and you realize the monastery's bells are the true rulers of the night. Every monastery had its own set of bells, each with a particular pitch, size, and role. They weren't just decoration. They were clocks, alarms, loudspeakers, and spiritual megaphones rolled into one. The first strike of the clapper cuts the air. Then the echo follows like ripples in water, bouncing across cloisters, courtyards, and dormitory beams. No monk could ignore it. Bells had authority, and in their iron voices, you hear the steady command: wake, pray, obey. You pull yourself upright, joining the shuffle of robes and sandals heading back toward the chapel. As you walk, you notice something. You're already learning the monastery sound map. The night here isn't silent. It's punctuated, marked, measured by noises at double commands. The toll of the great bell tells you when to rise. The crackle of the hearth tells you when warmth is rationed. The low hum of chant becomes a kind of lullaby that you can't quite escape. Even sleep here is soundtracked. Bells rang not just for prayers, but for practical tasks too. Some monasteries use different tones to distinguish between matins, lauds, and even wake-up calls for special vigils. Imagine a monk, trained like Pavlov's dog, reacting instantly to the distinct pattern of clangs. The bell doesn't ask, it demands. In fact, a mainstream historical fact worth noting is that medieval Europe as a whole borrowed this practice. Villages surrounding monasteries often regulated their own time by listening for the monastery bells. Your bedtime? The monks decided. Your morning market trip? Same answer. The monastery didn't just keep its own rhythm. It imposed on the landscape. But the bells weren't the only sonic cues. Monks were often assigned to night watches, a human supplement to the metal clapper. Picture Brother Stefan, bleary-eyed but stubborn, pacing the cloister with a lantern, making sure the lamps are burning and no one is dozed off during their prayer shift. His sandals scuff the flagstones, and that little sound becomes part of your memory of the night. Sometimes these watches doubled as guard duty. Not against raiders, though that occasionally happened, but against fire, the monastery's greatest enemy. A single candle left burning could undo centuries of labor in minutes. Of course, the bells and watches weren't always loved. Some monks, especially novices and youths of the routine, describe the clangs as torturous interruptions. Here's your quirky tidbit. A few abbots apparently experimented with bell ropes tied to novices' feet, yanking them awake when they were too stubborn to rise. Imagine a medieval alarm clock with a literal pull mechanism and zero snooze button. You can't make this up. You wonder whether the bells truly woke everyone, or whether some monks rolled over and pretended not to hear. Historians still argue whether strict attendance at every night office was enforced equally across all orders. Some evidence suggests that elderly or infirm monks were allowed to skip the midnight trek, while others hint at sleeping monks who drifted off in the chapel itself, their snores echoing embarrassingly between psalms. Were they punished? Were they pitted? The records are too coy, leaving us in the dark. As you listen to the night unfold, you realize that bells did more than mark time. They structured consciousness. Imagine living so in tune with sound that your body responded automatically. No wristwatch, no glowing screen, no 9 to 5. Just clang, shuffle, chant, silence. Over years, monks' very sense of night and day bent around the rhythm of bells, until a natural cycle of sunrise and sunset mattered less than the iron strike overhead. Between the bells, the night seems almost timeless. You catch yourself waiting for the next sound. The cough of an old monk, the squeak of sandals, the rustle of robes. The monastery has no traffic noise, no distant radios, no TV humming through walls. Sound is sparse, and that makes each one monumental. When a cricket chirps in the courtyard, it's practically a concert. When the wind pushes against the shutters, you imagine the saints sighing. Your modern brain itches for background noise, but here, silence is structured, not empty, and so you return again to the chapel, guided by nothing more than sound and obedience. Candles flicker, chants rise, and the night becomes another stretch of measured rhythm. You're exhausted, but oddly alert. Your ears, more than your eyes, are pulling you through this. 3 sleepy jokes hover in your mind as you settle back into the pew. First, monks were the original notification system, except instead of ding on your phone, you got a bronze gong at 1 a.m. Second, night watch monks were basically the medieval version of hall monitors, except with less sass and more psalms. Third, if you think your neighbor's car alarm is annoying, imagine that, but it's sacred and you're not allowed to complain. The bells will keep ringing, the watches will keep pacing, and you're caught in the sound map of monastic life. Night after night, this iron rhythm shapes you, chisels away at your individuality, until you no longer ask, what time is it? You only ask, what bell is that? And somehow, The answer always pulls you forward. You flop back down onto your straw mattress after yet another midnight shuffle, and your body feels the ache of constant interruption. You think you're finally about to sink into proper rest, but no, that would be far too merciful. Instead, what emerges is something stranger, something scholars now call biphasic sleep. For monks, it wasn't one solid block of shut-eye, but a rhythm of first sleep and second sleep. In your first round of rest, those early hours before matins, you catch shallow, fragile dreams. The bell yanks you awake at midnight. You shuffle, you chant, you groan. Then, when the service is over, you stumble back to your cot. And here comes the odd twist. Instead of being done with the night, you dive into a second stage of slumber, picking up where you left off. Like hitting pause on a dream, praying in the intermission, then pressing play again. Mainstream historical fact. References to segmented sleep appear not only in monasteries but across medieval households. Letters, legal records, even folk tales mention people waking naturally after first sleep and engaging in small activities. Praying, stoking fires, talking quietly, sometimes even slipping next door for neighborly visits, before lying down again for second sleep. Monks, it seems, were just the most institutionalized example of a much wider pattern. And yet, scholars still argue whether monks' biphasic sleep was fully intentional or simply the product of environment. Did the strict prayer schedule enforce it unnaturally, or was it already a cultural norm that the monastery just codified? The debate continues, and as you rub your eyes after yet another interruption, you wonder whether first sleep and second sleep were gifts of rhythm or just spiritualized jet lag. The in-between phase, the gap between first and second sleep, was often described as fertile time. Monks used it to recite psalms, contemplate scripture, or whisper private prayers. In the secular world, people sometimes use it for more, let's call them earthly matters. You smirk, realizing that monks skipped that part, channeling their wakefulness toward God instead of gossip or romance. Still, you can't help but think, if insomnia had a golden age, this was it. Quirky tidbit. Some monks recorded vivid dreams in these intervals, treating them as divine messages. One abbot reportedly kept a wax tablet by his bedside, scribbling down half-formed visions between sleep bouts. Whether holy inspiration or just cheese-fueled dream nonsense, these midnight notes sometimes made their way into sermons. Imagine your drowsy scribble about a giant talking fish becoming a metaphor for salvation at Sunday Mass. As you slip between these two phases of sleep, your own modern mind rebels. You're trained to expect a solid 8 hours, a nice rectangular block of unconsciousness. This fragmented rhythm feels like medieval torture. But oddly enough, some sleep researchers suggest biphasic rest might align more naturally with human biology. They point to circadian dips in historical accounts as evidence that maybe, just maybe, your Netflix-induced insomnia at 2 a.m. isn't a personal flaw, but a relic of ancient rhythms trying to resurface. Comforting thought, though you doubt your boss would accept sorry. I'm between first and second sleep as an excuse for being late. The bell rings again, and you feel like a puppet tugged by strings. Up you get, back to the chapel, chanting half awake, eyes drooping, thoughts drifting. You wonder how monks endured this for decades. Their body's been around a schedule that never once asked for their opinion. And then you realize that's the point. The broken sleep wasn't an accident. It was a method. By fragmenting the night, the monastery chipped away at the illusion of control. You didn't own your sleep. The rule did. 3 sleepy jokes bubble up as you stagger back toward bed. First, biphasic sleep was basically medieval split-screen mode, except one half was dreams and the other was chanting in Latin. Second, monks were the original night shift workers, minus the paycheck and plus eternal salvation. Third, if you've ever fallen asleep watching TV, woken up at 1 a.m. and then gone back to bed, that's your honorary monastic badge right there. When you finally collapse for a second sleep, the dormitory is hushed again. Breathing evens out. Straw crunches faintly, and you drift into a deeper slumber. This time, the dreams feel richer, thicker, as though your brain knows you've been through the ritual already. You sense why monks might have treasured this stage. It's less restless, more profound, almost sacred. And yet, even here, questions linger. Did all monks embrace the biphasic cycle? Or did some quietly curse it, longing for one uninterrupted stretch of rest? Historians still argue whether the fragmented schedule truly elevated devotion, or simply produced an army of permanently sleep-deprived men who learned to spiritualize their fatigue. For now, you just surrender. First sleep, prayer. Second sleep. The rhythm presses into you, a strange cradle rocking you between exhaustion and devotion. And as dawn creeps closer, you realize the monastery doesn't just control when you sleep. It controls how you sleep, reshaping even the architecture of your dreams. The second sleep has barely settled into your bones when the bell's echo drags you out again, this time not just to chant, but to labor. You shuffle down another stone corridor, this one narrower, colder, and lined with flickering sconces that throw long shadows on the wall. The air smells faintly of ink and vellum, a sharp tang that cuts through your drowsiness. Welcome to the scriptorium at midnight, a place where words, not dreams, are the material of the night. The room is warmer than the chapel, thanks to small braziers burning low, though the smoke stings your eyes. Long wooden desks stretch in neat rows, each fitted with slanted boards and a few scattered tools. Reed pens, sharpened quills, pumice for smoothing parchment, knives for trimming, pots of thick black ink. Monks huddle at their stations like quiet owls, their faces pale in the candlelight, their robes rustling softly as they shift. You join them, feeling that blend of reverence and irritation only sleep deprivation can produce. Copying manuscripts is no casual pastime here. It's a sacred duty. Every letter of scripture, every hymn, every theological tract must be transcribed perfectly, without blot or slip. One mainstream historical fact. In many monasteries, the scriptorium was the intellectual heart, the place where knowledge was preserved through centuries of political collapse and invasion. Without these night-scribbling monks, whole libraries of ancient wisdom might have been lost. Your pen scratches across parchment, and you realize you're literally keeping civilization afloat, though your drooping eyelids don't seem to care. But here's the quirk. Not every monk was a saintly copyist. Some grew so weary that they dozed off mid-sentence, their quills trailing little ink comets across the page. There are actual surviving manuscripts where marginal notes reveal monks' complaints. It is very cold, or this parchment is terrible, or my personal favorite, oh, my hand. You grin at the idea of a medieval scribe sneakily venting centuries before Twitter existed. And tucked between holy texts, doodles sometimes appear. Cats chasing mice, monks caricature with oversized noses, even a few indecent jokes. So much for perfect solemnity. Historians still argue whether monks really worked this late at night, or whether the romantic picture of midnight scribes is exaggerated. Some claim that illumination, those elaborate golden designs, was too precise for candlelight, suggesting most was done by day. Others counter with evidence of soot marks, notes about dim lamps, and rules forbidding idleness during night watches. Was the midnight scriptorium more myth than fact, or a genuine fixture of monastic life? The debate refuses to settle, and here you sit, quill in hand, a living experiment in whether artistry can survive exhaustion. The atmosphere is hypnotic. The scratch of quills blends with a steady drip of wax. The faint hiss of braziers, the rustle of vellum sheets being turned. It's not silence. It's a layered hush, the sound of dozens of tiny labors converging into something larger. Occasionally, a monk clears his throat or sneezes, or mutters a prayer when his pen slips. These micro sounds, in the middle of the night, take on an outsized presence. They remind you that behind every illuminated capital letter is a weary human being fighting to stay awake. You look around and notice the strategies monks use to battle fatigue. Some chewed fennel seeds or dipped cloths in cold water to dab their faces. Others leaned on their wooden staffs, a posture halfway between sitting and standing, nodding off without fully collapsing. A few, though officially forbidden, probably snuck micronaps under the desk, hidden by the oversized parchment boards. You imagine Brother Peter curled up like a cat, ink-stained fingers twitching in his sleep, only to jerk awake when the abbot's footsteps creak the floor. And because your modern brain can't resist, 3 jokes slip into the haze. First, monks were the first co-working space crowd, except their startup was eternal salvation. Second, Marginal doodles were basically the medieval version of Slack emojis, little winks across centuries of boredom. Third, the midnight scriptorium was the original night shift, but instead of coffee breaks, you got psalms and sore wrists. As the hours drag on, the work itself becomes strangely meditative. Each letter, each curl, each precise stroke forces your brain into focus. The exhaustion dulls the edges of thought, leaving only the rhythm of writing. The page fills, time blurs, and you realize that in some odd way, this labor is prayer itself, ink turned into devotion. The monotony becomes transcendence, or at least that's what you tell yourself while stifling a yawn. By the time the bell calls you back to the chapel for lauds, your body feels both drained and buzzing, your mind caught between ink stains and whispered chants. You shuffle out of the scriptorium, leaving behind half-finished, words glowing faintly in the candlelight. And as dawn begins to tease the horizon, you understand. The night here is not about sleep. It's about discipline woven into every act, whether chanting, watching, or writing. The monks have mastered the art of turning exhaustion into holiness. You, meanwhile, are just trying not to drool on your parchment. You stagger out of the scriptorium with ink-stained fingers, your eyelids heavy and your shoulders aching. By now, any normal person would collapse into bed and refuse to budge until noon. But monks? Monks had a different idea. For them, sleep wasn't always the goal. It was sometimes the enemy. And now you step into one of the strangest corners of monastic life, deliberate sleeplessness. The idea sounds absurd to your modern brain. Who in their right mind chooses to be more tired? But in the medieval monastery, wakefulness had its own prestige. Vigils, long stretches of intentional night prayer, were a mark of devotion. The logic went like this. If Christ prayed to the night before his crucifixion, then surely his followers could manage a few dark hours of wakefulness. So monks embrace practices designed to keep them upright, eyes open, minds fixed on God, or at least try not to faceplant into the hymnals. A mainstream historical fact. Vigils were formally baked into many monastic rules. The Rule of St. Benedict, one of the most influential sets of monastic guidelines, specifically prescribes waking in the night for matins, even in winter when the dark stretched longest. Staying awake wasn't an accident. It was obedience and action. But some monks went further. Here's a quirky tidbit. A few cultivated the art of staff sleeping. They would stand or sit holding a wooden staff, leaning just enough to rest without collapsing, training themselves to nap in bursts without ever fully surrendering to slumber. Imagine medieval power napping, except instead of desk and swivel chair, you got a drafty cloister and a stern abbot watching. Other monks experimented with outright asceticism, pushing their bodies towards sleepless extremes. Some wore hair shirts, itchy garments made from coarse animal hair, to make lying down uncomfortable a kind of anti-pajama strategy. Others scattered stones in their bedding, so that rest was more punishment than reward. And some cultivated a habit of never lying flat at all, preferring to doze upright on stools. It wasn't about masochism for its own sake. It was about fighting the temptation of comfort, treating weariness as a ladder toward holiness. Yet historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or exceptional. Did most monks really torture themselves out of sleep? Or were these outliers, dramatic examples meant to inspire awe in text but rarely imitated in real life? It's one thing for a saintly figure to claim, I only slept 2 hours a night, and another for 100 tired men in one monastery to copy him without collapsing en masse. The truth, likely, lies in the gray space between inspiration and reality. You walk back into the chapel during one of these vigils, and the air feels different. The chants are slower, drawn out, echoing across the high stone vaults. Shadows flicker like restless spirits. A few monks sway with exhaustion, lips still moving in prayer. You can almost see them negotiating with their own bodies. Stay awake, stay upright. One more psalm. This is spiritual battle disguised as yawning. There's a haunting beauty to it. By choosing sleeplessness, the monks made the night itself their offering. Where you or I might fight insomnia with warm milk or melatonin, they leaned into it, turning their fatigue into prayer. The world outside was asleep, but in here, the cloister burned with whispered devotion. Still, the comedy of exhaustion sneaks through. Imagine a monk jerking awake mid-chant, blurting out the wrong Latin verse, or nodding so hard his head smacks the wooden stall. Picture Brother Thomas snoring while still technically upright, the abbot coughing loudly to wake him, and the whole choir suppressing laughter. Even in the holiest vigils, human bodies don't always cooperate. 3 jokes drift into your mind like drowsy fireflies. First, monks invented the original all-nighter, except instead of Red Bull, they had holy water. Second, staff sleeping monks were basically cosplaying as flamingos, balanced, half asleep, and hoping not to topple over. Third, hair shirts were the medieval equivalent of setting your bed to extra firm, except dialed up to sadistic. As you witness the vigil, your own body starts to sympathize. Every fiber screams for rest. But in the strange logic of the monastery, that screaming is the point. The denial of sleep becomes a kind of purification, stripping you down until only willpower remains. Whether this truly brought them closer to God or simply made them cranky is another matter. One historians still debate in hushed tones. When the vigil ends, the monks don't collapse into bed as you expect. Some doze briefly, yes, but others move straight into work, tending gardens, grinding herbs, or preparing the refectory. Their rhythm isn't built on maximizing rest. It's built on discipline as defiance. You rub your eyes, marveling at how they kept this up for years, even decades. And as dawn begins to creep faintly at the edges of the sky, you realize something profound. In the monastery, sleep was never just biological. It was moral, spiritual, even political. To sleep too much was laziness. To sleep too little was sanctity. And to live in that tightrope balance was obedience. The secret, if you can call it that, is that monks didn't just schedule sleep, they weaponized it. Meanwhile, you'd sell your soul for a pillow in 8 uninterrupted hours. You've now seen monks fighting against sleep, as if it were a sly adversary. But what about when sleep simply refused to come at all? Even the most disciplined brother could not command his body like a loyal servant. Insomnia, dreams, night terrors, these belong to monastery just as much as chanting and candlelight. And so you drift into a quieter corner of the night. Remedies, dreams, and the strange world of medieval nighttime medicine. Picture yourself lying on a thin straw mattress in the dormitory. The rest of the monks are already breathing in unison, the occasional snore breaking the rhythm like a discordant drumbeat. But your mind spins. You think about the psalms you stumbled over earlier, the herb garden that needs tending tomorrow, maybe even the way Brother Matthew dropped the bread at dinner and pretended nobody saw. Sleep will not come, and you know what that means. Time to try one of the monastery's remedies. A mainstream historical fact here. Monks were some of the most literate men of their time, and many monasteries kept herbals, manuals describing plants and their uses. These weren't just recipes for soup. They were survival guides for aches, pains, and yes, sleepless nights. Chamomile, poppy, and valerian were all listed as helpful for inducing drowsiness. Monks would steep leaves in hot water, create simple tinctures, or even stuff their pillows with aromatic herbs in hopes of coaxing their bodies into rest. Then come the quirkier tidbits. Some monks whisper protective prayers or lullabies over the sleepless, believing demons sometimes prowl the edges of dream. A popular charm might involve reciting the names of the Magi 3 times, almost like counting sheep, except your sheep happen to be Balthazar, Melchior, and Casper. And yes, there's a record of monks using pigeon dung mixed with vinegar as a kind of sleep salve rubbed on the temples. You're welcome for that mental image. Good luck getting drowsy after imagining bird droppings smeared on your forehead. Historians still argue whether monks believed dreams themselves were divine messages or simply random brain static. Augustine, centuries earlier, had cautioned believers not to take every dream seriously. Sometimes they were just indigestion after too much lentil stew. But many monks wrote dream accounts in their journals, debating whether visions of angels or demons at night were warnings or temptations. One poor novice reportedly confessed that he dreamed of roast chicken during a fast, and he felt so guilty he asked for penance. Imagine trying to explain that in confession. "Father, forgive me, for I drooled on my pillow." You wander through the infirmary now, a place that smells like thyme and honey, where remedies are prepared by candlelight. A monk in a rough wool habit stirs a pot of warm milk laced with herbs. He hums under his breath, a tune that sounds halfway between a lullaby and a psalm. In one corner, another brother carefully copies recipes into a leather-bound book, his handwriting looping like the curves of a vine. Every concoction is part science, part faith, part hope, and the remedies extend beyond herbs. Some believe the position of the stars influenced whether sleep would come easily. Astrology crept into monastery through medical texts, suggesting that a monk born under Saturn might be prone to melancholy and restless nights. Others swore by dietary changes. Avoid onions after sunset, or you'll be staring at the rafters until dawn. Of course, comedy always sneaks in. Imagine a monk rubbing pigeon paste on his head, while another mutters a lullaby, and a third waves incense in the dormitory like a fumigator. It sounds like the setup for a medieval sketch show. Joke 1. Monks basically invented aromatherapy, except half the scents smelled like barnyard accidents. Joke 2. When told to count sheep, a monk probably thought, "Too easy, I live with them." Joke 3. Dreams of roast chicken might have been the medieval equivalent of binge-watching cooking shows before bed. But deeper than the laughter, there's something endearing in how earnestly they tried. Insomnia wasn't brushed off. It was treated as a spiritual and physical ailment, worthy of remedy and prayer. To lie awake in the dark was to risk temptation, melancholy, or even despair. And so every herb, every whispered incantation, every soft chant was an act of care, one brother watching over another in the long hours of the night. You pause at the edge of a dormitory once more. One monk lies curled in his blanket, finally lulled into slumber by valerian tea. Another twitches in a restless dream, muttering Latin phrases between snores. The abbot himself paces the hall, keeping an eye on the flock. In this world, sleep is never private. It's communal, observed, guided, and sometimes even corrected. And you realize that while the remedies may seem odd or outdated, the impulse is timeless. You, too, have probably searched for the perfect trick to fall asleep. An app, a weighted blanket, a late-night YouTube history video, a ham. The monks simply reached for what they had: herbs, prayers, bird dung, and the endless patience of faith. As the candles gutter low, the night begins to yield. You feel the room exhale as dozens of bodies finally surrender to rest. And you? You feel yourself drifting, half amused, half comforted, lulled by the rhythm of remedies old and strange. The medieval night has its medicine, and in its own odd way it works. The faintest gray creeps through the narrow windows, and you feel the monastery exhale as though the whole building has been holding its breath all night. Dawn has come, and with it the final stretch of the monk's secret rhythm. After hours of vigils, strange remedies, and whispered prayers, the community slowly rises to meet the day. But these last moments of the night hold their own stories, their own little confessions tucked into corners the official records barely mention. The bells ring again, but softer than at midnight. This is the hour before lauds, when the sun is only just beginning to press its fingers across the stone floor. The monks shuffle out of the dormitory, rubbing their eyes, their bare feet whispering against the flagstones. Some look bright, as though they've been awake for days and are fueled by pure devotion. Others look like you feel at 7 a.m. on a Monday, half dead, already dreaming of breakfast. A mainstream historical fact. Morning prayers, especially lauds, were meant to align the monks' rhythm with creation itself. As the world woke, so did the community. The chant was like joining the choir of nature. The birds outside, the roosters crowing, and the monks inside forming a harmony of dawn. The logic was simple. Start the day in praise, and everything else would fall into order. But peel back the solemn surface, and you find quirks hiding in plain sight. A few monks were known to sneak tiny naps during the transition from night to day, curling up on benches in cloisters or pretending to pray very, very still. A wink from an older brother often spared them from correction. After all, who hadn't nodded off once or twice after chanting through the night. Others found ways to stash personal items in the dormitory. A favorite blanket, a scrap of parchment with a private prayer, even a smuggled candle stub for reading after curfew. These were the little rebellions, small and human, hiding beneath the strict scaffolding of monastic order. Historians still argue whether monks truly maintained this level of strict scheduling every single day, or whether real life crept in, oversleeping, bargaining with the bell ringer, trading night watch duties like kids trading snacks. Some chronicles boast of iron discipline, but the silence of daily records leaves room for suspicion. After all, what Abbott would proudly write, half the choir was asleep during lauds a day? The scene unfolds before you, the church filling with soft golden light, voices rising in psalms, the air smelling faintly of wax and damp wool. Your body longs for a warm bed, yet the monks seem oddly energized by the routine. Their lives have trained them to accept exhaustion as normal, to braid weariness into prayer. Even so, you spot one novice blinking furiously, swaying like a tree in the breeze. His lips still move, but you know he's dreaming with his eyes half open. And then comes work. Once lauds is complete, the brothers stream out toward their daily tasks. Tending fields, baking bread, feeding animals, repairing books. The night secret schedule disappears into daylight labor, as if none of the strange rituals, naps, and whispered remedies ever happened. But you know they did. You walk with them through the dark, and you've seen the cracks in the official script. 3 final jokes slip in, because even dawn deserves a grin. First, monks invented the snooze button by simply ignoring the bell until the abbot scolded them. Second, hidden candles with a medieval version of scrolling TikTok under the covers. Third, if you ever wonder what true discipline looks like, remember that these men prayed to the night and still had the energy to milk cows at sunrise, while you complain about needing coffee before checking email. The sun rises fully now, painting the sky with fire. The monastery hums with renewed purpose, but you keep thinking about the hidden lives, the naps, the secret comforts, the debates over dreams and remedies. These were men, not machines. Their sleep schedule was part obedience, part improvisation, part survival. And what they left behind in their writings is only half the story. The other half, the smuggled nap, the whispered lullaby, the stolen scrap of candle, belongs to shadows of the dormitory and the fading hours before dawn. These are the secrets the chronicles didn't bother to preserve, but which still cling to the stones if you know how to listen. And as you step out into the bright morning, blinking against the light, you realize that the monk's strange, exhausting, beautiful rhythm wasn't just about sleep at all. It was about shaping every moment, wakeful or weary, into an offering. Whether historians untangle the truth or not, the echo of that rhythm still lingers, whispering in the quiet hours when you, too, lie awake and wonder what the night is for.